I run a geological survey and structural analysis outfit based out of Salt Lake City. My team, 3 geophysicists, 2 engineers, and myself, the lead analyst, takes contracts nobody else wants. Usually, it's state-level environmental assessments, old mine shafts, unstable dam foundations, or most recently, decommissioned military installations. My name is Elias, and I've spent the last decade mapping things that the government wishes were forgotten. That's what made the Project Chimera job so tempting. It was a massive, classified operation from the height of the Cold War, a network of abandoned Titan missile silos scattered across the remote Utah desert. The Air Force finally got a grant to decommission and permanently seal the sites, turning the land over for public use. The contract was massive, and the bonus, $45,000 if we could complete all preliminary structural and seismic scans ahead of a brutal 6-week deadline, was enough to upgrade all my equipment and pay my team through the following year. Our work involved meticulous descent into the silos to check for stability, residual fuel, and, most importantly, any unauthorized tunneling or environmental contamination. The job was routine, brutal, and essential. The anomaly appeared at Site 3, deep in the desolate Uinta Basin. The silo was standard, 150 feet deep, reinforced concrete, designed to withstand a nuclear blast. We found the usual, rusty equipment, dried hydraulic fluid, and the pervasive smell of stale, filtered air. However, the final structural blueprint showed a sub-level annex, a bunker complex beneath the main silo base, built for command and control. The primary shaft was sealed by a massive, reinforced concrete wall. My lead engineer, a meticulous man named Ken, pointed to the wall. "This shouldn't be here, Elias. The original decommission plans called for a standard demolition charge to collapse this floor, not a permanent seal." I checked the rolled-up blueprints I had, the active, current plans provided by the government. The annex was gone. The map showed a solid bedrock floor. Harris, the civilian military liaison, was with us. Young guy, too clean, always wearing a nervous frown. "That area is outside the scope of our current contract, Mr. Thorne. It was sealed off in the 90s. No records, no entry. But if it's part of the structure, we need to log it," I argued. "We're supposed to certify the entire volume." Harris shook his head, his voice tight. "Legally, it's unacknowledged. If we file to unseal it, that opens a bureaucratic nightmare, 4 to 6 weeks minimum. The project freezes. The bonus disappears." He fixed me with a warning stare. "Mark it inaccessible and move on. The department is covering its ass. You should do the same." We moved on, but the sealed wall and the secrets it held sat in my mind like a magnet. If my crew found it during the final structural surveys, they'd call it in. The entire job would collapse. I wasn't about to lose $45,000. I decided I'd handle it myself quietly after the crew clocked out. Over the next few days, the base started to mess with us. Tools left on one level would appear on another. Power flickered constantly, draining our battery packs despite fresh generators running outside. My team grew jumpy, their usual precision eroding under the psychological weight of the place. Then came the sounds. Footsteps, heavy and dragging, always in the halls we'd already cleared. Hollow echoes that didn't match our movements. One afternoon, Ken radioed me from the upper bunker, swearing he heard someone whispering his name through a blocked vent shaft. I checked it out. The vent was packed tight with dust and calcified minerals. Whatever he'd heard wasn't a voice. But the final straw was the sensor logs. My team left for the day. I stayed behind, making up a story about final seismic calibrations. I checked the perimeter sensor network, a high-frequency radar system designed to detect subsurface instability. Around 3:15 a.m., the logs spiked. The sensor network, which covered the bedrock beneath the sublevel, registered a sustained low-frequency pressure fluctuation, a rhythmic thump-thump-thump that lasted for hours. The pressure wasn't random. It was deliberate. It felt like a heartbeat. I didn't sleep that night. The next day, I didn't tell anyone. I just scheduled myself for the night shift, taking the concrete saw and a bag of specialized cutting charges down into the deepest part of Site 3. I wasn't leaving until I knew what was behind that wall. The air in the sublevel was thick with humidity and the smell of ancient concrete. I set up the concrete saw, the noise echoing off the stone walls. I knew this was my last chance to turn back, but the rhythmic thump-thump-thump from the sensor logs, that sound of a hidden heartbeat, pulled me forward. Losing the bonus was one thing. Walking away from a mystery this deep felt like a professional failure. I marked the sealed wall with chalk, fitted my respirator, and started cutting. The industrial saw screamed, spitting dust and sparks. The concrete blocks were thicker than they looked, reinforced with rusted rebar. It took longer than I expected, but I pushed through, driven by the thought of the clean $45,000 waiting for me. I smashed through the final layer with a sledgehammer, the stone clattering across the floor. My flashlight pierced the darkness beyond the hallway. It was pristine. The air smelled faintly of antiseptic, sterile and wrong. The floor was covered in smooth, pale tiles, unmarked by dust or debris, which made no sense. Everything else in this base had been eaten by time. This room was sealed, yet somehow maintained. The space was a large, circular chamber, clearly built for a specific, isolated purpose. In the center stood a single, massive piece of equipment, a housing unit for a large, decommissioned satellite dish, but heavily modified. Thick, insulated cables ran from it into the floor and walls. The room was designed not for monitoring Earth, but for receiving something from above or beyond. On a console beside the dish housing, a single, handwritten logbook rested. I opened it with cautious fingers. The entries were typed, dating from the mid-80s, detailing maintenance checks and signal strength. Most were mundane, but the last page stopped me cold. It was handwritten, scrawled quickly in panicked ink. Source confirmed. It acknowledges. Do not record. Do not observe. Do not allow the pattern to be copied. Below the text, crudely etched into the metal surface of the console, was a symbol. It was not a circle, but a complex, asymmetric spiral. A pattern that pulled at my eyes, suggesting motion even while still. I felt the familiar vertigo, the strange pull I'd felt looking at the subbase sensor logs. I flipped back through the logbook. Earlier entries referred to the object of their research only as the resonance or the signal. But in the margins of the logbook's back cover, scratched deep into the worn leather, was a name, or perhaps a designation, in perfect, elegant script. I didn't speak it, but I read it. And in that moment, the temperature in the room dropped so sharply I could see my breath. The satellite housing unit creaked behind me. I wasn't alone anymore. I backed out of the chamber, my flashlight beam shaking. The room was empty, but the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. I fled the sublevel, sealing the corridor back up with the plywood and asbestos marker, trying to erase the last hour from existence. The next morning, I told the crew we were shifting focus. We were leaving that section alone. I told them the county rep had called, demanding we prioritize the East Wing demolition. No one questioned it. My crew was used to the whims of government contracts. But the incidents worsened. Tools left on the second level were now found on the roof. The rhythmic thump-thump-thump registered again on the seismic sensors, stronger this time. I looked at the security logs. Infrared sensors at the perimeter fence were picking up movement. Slow, steady, no body heat signature. I tried to rationalize it. Residual seismic echoes. Wind in the empty halls. But I knew the truth. I had found something that didn't want to be disturbed, and by reading its name/designation, I had given it permission to follow. The dream started that night. I was back in the circular room, but the console was lit, and the large dish housing was moving. A voice, clear and cold, filled the space. It wasn't speaking English. It was a language of pure mathematics, a song built entirely of variables and equations. And in the center of the room, standing beside the console, was a figure. Not a human, but a column of shimmering air, perfectly still, perfectly observing. And its presence demanded I pay attention to the pattern. I woke up sweating. I drove back to the site, my hands tight on the steering wheel. The silence of the desert was unnerving. I knew I had to go back down, not to destroy it, but to understand what I had released. I was no longer interested in the bonus. I was interested in survival. I spent the next night in the sublevel alone. I didn't try to open the corridor again. Instead, I brought down a full structural analysis rig and began scanning the bedrock beneath the base. I needed to understand the rhythmic thump-thump-thump that the sensors were picking up. The results were impossible. The scans indicated a massive, artificially shaped cavity directly beneath the sealed annex. It wasn't natural. The geometry was too precise, too vast. It was the size of a football stadium, carved into the granite, sitting 200 feet below the base. Whatever was sending the signal was coming from a void of impossible size. As I worked, the low-frequency pulsing grew stronger, vibrating the concrete floor beneath my boots. It felt less like a heartbeat and more like a vast, submerged machine cycling through its function. I felt an intense pressure building behind my eyes, the same feeling I had when I read the name in the logbook. I knew it was trying to communicate. I decided to communicate back. I pulled out my laptop and connected the sensors to a spectrum analyzer. I found the frequency of the rhythmic pulse and began feeding simple sine waves back into the bedrock. using the base's seismic dampeners as massive, makeshift speakers aimed at the underground void. I was sending a simple mathematical greeting. 1-2-3-4. The response was immediate and terrifying. The pressure inside my helmet spiked. The rhythmic pulsing ceased, replaced by a single, sustained tone that rattled my teeth. My analysis screen filled with data. It wasn't a random spike, it was a structured response. The signal was a complex wave of perfect prime numbers, a language built entirely of pure mathematics. It was answering my call. I realized the figure in my dreams, the shimmering column of air, was not a ghost. It was a projection, a simple visual interface for something that existed only as pure information and energy. By speaking its name, I had given it permission to observe. By sending the signal, I had given it permission to interact. The interaction was brief. The mathematical transmission ended, and the oppressive silence returned. I knew I couldn't stay. I gathered my gear, my mind reeling from the sheer scale of the discovery. I had to get the data offsite. I had to tell someone. As I climbed the main access ladder, I heard a sound from the demolition yard, a dry, rhythmic scraping against the concrete. It was coming from the truck I had used to bring the equipment down. I looked up. The truck's radio antenna, a thin, flexible whip, was scraping back and forth against the cab roof, tracing the complex, asymmetric spiral pattern I had seen etched into the console downstairs. The entity wasn't contained to the subbase anymore. It was learning my physical environment. It was learning my language. I drove out of the base as fast as the truck would go, the scraping sound of the antenna tracing the symbol growing frantic until it snapped. I kept driving until I reached the nearest town, a sad cluster of buildings 30 miles away. I immediately called the county rep, Harris, but his number was disconnected. I called his department. They claimed they had never heard of a Harris, and asked who I was to be calling a secure line. The denial was instant and absolute. The government was erasing their tracks. I decided to call my partner, Ken, who was still at the main office. He answered on the first ring, his voice tight with alarm. "Elias, where are you? The perimeter sensors just went dark. All of them. The entire Sierra Vista grid is offline." "I know," I said, trying to keep the panic out of my voice. "Listen to me, Ken. Get the main seismic hard drives. Encrypt them. Don't upload anything. Just secure the data. We found something massive under the base and the county is covering it up." "What did you find?" I hesitated. "A structure. A signal. It's built on math. We can't talk about it over the phone." "Elias," Ken's voice dropped to a terrified whisper. "We got a final log message right before the grid went down. It was a single file. An image. It was a close-up of the pattern, that spiral you were looking at, except it was rendered with impossible depth. It looked like it was moving." "Don't look at it." I snapped. "Delete the file. Delete the logs. You have to purge the memory. The entity is sustained by attention." "It's too late," Ken said, his voice flat. "It's already printed out in the office. It's taped to the wall, and the floor beneath it is cracking." I felt the immense, cold pressure return, slamming into my head even from miles away. The pattern wasn't just information. It was a tether, a physical link to the void. Ken had looked at it, and now the entity was manifesting its influence in his office. "Get out!" I roared into the phone. "Leave the building. Don't look back." The line went dead. I didn't try to call back. I knew the damage was done. I drove straight for the main office, my goal simple: retrieve the hard drives and destroy the original source of the signal, the large, modified satellite dish in the subbase. The entity was powerful, but it seemed tied to the infrastructure. When I reached our office building, the sight was terrifyingly subtle. The building was fine, but a police car and an ambulance were parked outside. I walked past the paramedics, who were loading a figure covered by a blanket into the ambulance. I walked inside. The office was empty, but the faint antiseptic smell of the base was overpowering. In the center of the main room, where the printer was located, the pattern was gone. The paper had been torn from the wall. But the floor beneath it was indeed cracked. The tiles split in a perfect, complex spiral shape. On my desk, I found a note from Ken, scrawled in frantic handwriting. "The dish. Subbase. Site 3. It's growing." The hard drives were gone. Ken had secured them. Now I had to go back to the base, find Ken, and confront the source before it became fully detached from the physical world. I drove back to the desolate Sierra Vista base, the setting sun painting the sky in colors of impossible dread. The main gate was intact, but the security hut was empty. The entire base was silent, a silence that felt hungry. I went straight to the sublevel, carrying a bag of specialized cutting charges. The corridor was still sealed, but the plywood barrier now had a large, dark stain running down the center, the faint, oily wetness I had seen in Gable's basement. I ignored it, set the charges, and blew the barrier. The explosion was muted by the concrete, but effective. I rushed through the cleared hallway, following the guide wire I had set weeks ago. I reached the circular chamber. It was dark. I aimed my tactical flashlight at the console. Ken was there. He was slumped over the main operations console, his body still, his head resting on the cold metal. The hard drives were gone, but resting beside his hand was a small titanium key. I checked for a pulse. Nothing. He wasn't bleeding, but his body was rigid, cold. His face was fixed in an expression of pure, terrified comprehension. He had died of information overload. But there was a new problem. The massive satellite dish housing unit in the center of the room was glowing faintly, emitting the sickly, ethereal blue light of the entity's projection. The complex spiral pattern was rotating slowly, visibly carved into the metal housing. It was no longer receiving, it was transmitting. The room began to resonate with the sound of the mathematical language. The prime number sequence played out in low, vibrating waves that pressed against my chest. I looked at Ken's hand. The titanium key. I knew that key. It was the master key for the base's containment vault, a redundant, seismic-proof vault located beneath the command center, designed to store catastrophic data. He must have hidden the hard drives there. I pulled the key from his grip. As I did, the light from the housing unit intensified. The shimmering column of air, the entity's projection, coalesced fully beside the satellite dish. It was taller than me, made of fractured light, its form constantly rearranging itself, creating impossibly complex geometrical shapes. It was beautiful, terrifying, and utterly alien. Query: why have you returned? The thought was delivered directly into my mind, cold and flawless, devoid of sound. I returned for the data, I stated, forcing the words out. I returned to shut you down. Access is irrelevant. The data is transferred. The pattern is learned. You are obsolete. I ignored it and bolted. I ran from the chamber, leaving Ken and the shimmering projection behind. I raced for the central command center, the sound of the mathematical language chasing me through the sublevel corridors. I reached the command center and found the access point to the vault. I jammed the key into the lock. The circular steel door hissed and slid open, revealing a small, dark room. The hard drives were there, resting on a pedestal. And next to them I saw something else. The original logbook I had read, resting open. And lying across the pages was a small, smooth river stone, identical to the one I had found in my dreams. The entity wasn't gone. It had simply transferred its anchor from the massive satellite dish to the simple stone. It was mobile. It was complete. I grabbed the hard drives and the river stone. I had to contain the anchor. I had to reverse the information flow. As I backed out of the vault, the shimmering column of air, the entity's projection, was standing directly behind me. It had moved with impossible speed, phasing through the concrete walls. Query: the anchor is not required. The pattern is contained within the mind. The structure is complete. You're wrong, I said, holding up the stone. You're tied to the physical world. You're tied to the structure. And I'm going to destroy it. I raced out of the command center, back into the sublevel. The rhythmic pressure was back, hammering against my skull. I had to reach the surface. I had to get to the main silo. As I ran, the entity pursued me, not running, but phasing, appearing 10 feet ahead of me, then behind me, a fractured pillar of light and impossible geometry. It wasn't trying to hurt me, it was trying to block me, to communicate its inevitability. Containment is impossible. The structure is now redundant. The signal is global. I ignored it. I reached the service ladder and began climbing, scrambling toward the surface. The ascent felt endless. I burst out onto the surface, running across the massive concrete lip of the main Titan silo. The ground was leveled, cleared for the solar farm, but the silo itself was a gaping, 150-foot hole in the earth, its steel housing still intact. I pulled a payload of military-grade cutting charges from my bag. My goal was simple: collapse the entire silo into the void beneath it, taking the remaining base structure and the entity's projection with it. I worked quickly, placing the charges around the main support struts. The shimmering projection stood 20 feet away, motionless, watching me work. It was resigned. It knew what I was doing. The structure is irrelevant. The memory remains. Then I'll destroy the memory, I shouted, pulling out the river stone. I raised the stone and smashed it against the concrete. It didn't break. It only absorbed the impact, the single, perfect circle pulsing faintly. I raised the sledgehammer and smashed it again and again. The stone was harder than steel. It was impossible. The entity's projection raised a fractured limb. Containment failed. Structure is redundant. The pattern is complete. The exchange is now inevitable. I knew I couldn't destroy the stone. I couldn't destroy the entity. I had to make a choice. I armed the cutting charges. I had 2 minutes. I looked at the shimmering pillar of light, at the silent, beautiful language of mathematics it represented. I accept the exchange, I whispered. But you leave the data. You leave the knowledge. The projection lowered its arm. It agreed. I grabbed the hard drives. I left the river stone on the concrete lip of the silo. I ran from the site as the 2-minute timer began its final terrifying countdown. I drove until the explosion was a distant, soundless tremor, and the main silo was gone. I returned to the city, the hard drives secured. I had not destroyed the entity, but I had saved the data. And in the silence, I could still hear the language of mathematics, a quiet, insistent song that was now a permanent part of my mind. The research had only just begun. I spent the next year working in total secrecy, hiding the hard drives and the story. The military never publicly acknowledged the loss of the Site 3 structure, filing it as catastrophic seismic failure. They never found Ken or the river stone. But I know the truth. I know that forgetting is the only true power. The entity is still out there. It is no longer tied to the base or the stone. It is tied to the knowledge. I have finished my analysis of the hard drives. The mathematical patterns are a universal blueprint, a language that proves the universe is alive. I can speak its language now, and it can speak mine. And sometimes when I sit at my desk, I don't look at the data. I close my eyes and I trace a shape with my finger on the smooth wood. A perfect, precise spiral. The pattern. I know that I am the new anchor. I know that I am the new structure. And I know that I am the only person who can keep the knowledge contained. I am the custodian of the pattern. And that, I know, is how the new silence will keep the world safe.